The smell of burnt oil still clung to my hands as I walked through the quiet hallway of the house. The clock read 9 p.m., but outside the world seemed to have gone to sleep hours ago. Portland has these cold October breezes, seeping through cracks in the windows, bringing a promise of unease. For the past few weeks, my only focus has been on keeping everything running. The house, the engines in the garage, the plants in the garden, and, most importantly, the peace of our home. I've always been a man of routine. My name is Greg. At 42, life brought me here, far from the noisy bars and unpredictable nights that used to fill my days before Olivia. I traded the clamor of old late nights for the metallic clinking of wrenches, for the peculiar silence that fills the evenings of a rebuilt family. Olivia came into my life, bringing a lightness I didn't know existed. With her came Josh, her 19-year-old son. I'm not the kind of stepdad who gets into everything. I prefer to observe, give him space, and learn about boundaries. Being a mechanic is my passion, especially working on motorcycles that tell stories through their rust. I keep my own ghosts buried between scrap metal and technical books, thinking I can control the peace around me. Today, with Olivia away for a week on a work trip, the house was all my responsibility. The silence seemed louder, the anticipation more palpable. Josh was around, but distant, lost in his own worries as a teenager in transition. I was raised to respect privacy, but some things, as I would discover that night, simply demand more than respect. They require courage. This story is about how one ordinary night became unforgettable. And if you want to come along for the ride, go ahead and hit that like button, because every detail here could be the next surprise in your life. The house we live in is a low-key sanctuary on a tree-lined street in Portland. The leaves are already changing color, turning shades of orange, and I've started picking up the first signs of autumn from the backyard lawn. It's an unremarkable house, but full of little habits we've built over time. Shelves packed with old books, small paintings Olivia picked out, and a few motorcycle parts scattered around the living room. My memory capsules. Mornings invariably start with strong coffee and the roar of the bikes I'm assembling in the background. I follow the ritual, inspecting cylinders, changing oil, and organizing parts in their precise place. The smell of grease soon fills the garage, while outside the wind echoes through the tall trees. At the end of the workday, I go up to wash my hands, and I usually eat lunch alone. Josh tends to come home late, almost invisible, says little, and disappears quickly into his room. What you're hearing here is just the beginning. The full, unfiltered stories with all the details you can imagine are available now. Check the link in the description right now. In my free time, I sit in the armchair by the window, watching the street and reading an old manual. I love the calm, the sound of birds taking flight at the end of the day, the smell of wet earth. This serenity hides a tension that's almost imperceptible. When Olivia is away, the house feels different, as if each room reveals a gray area between the seconds. With Josh, our life together is subtle. He goes about his chores, works a few hours at the corner market, and comes home tired. We talk only when necessary, without crossing into emotional territory. I still haven't learned if I should push or wait. On these days, I make sure everything works, not for perfection, but out of a commitment to keeping our home a safe place. For me, for Olivia, for Josh. Routine becomes a shell that protects me from emotional emergencies. But behind that shell, every silence says so much more than the apparent gestures. I was almost finished reading a manual about carburetors when I heard the shower turn on. It wasn't unusual for Josh to shower late after his shift. But this time, I noticed a detail that broke our silent routine. The bathroom door was left ajar, something he never did. I caught a glimpse of steam escaping, the purplish light from the bedside lamp reflecting, and a muffled sound of water hitting the floor. I wanted to ignore it. Privacy is sacred. But something told me his carelessness wasn't accidental. Without wasting time, I walked down the hall, knocking softly on the wooden door. My voice was a little quieter than usual. "Everything okay in there, Josh?" From the other side, silence. I only heard the persistent sound of the shower and a clatter of something falling on the floor, maybe shampoo or soap. I waited a few seconds before trying again. "Can I help with anything?" This time I felt the tremor in his response, a near whisper coming from inside the warm fog of the bathroom. "I'm good." For some inexplicable reason, I stood there, frozen, in front of that scene. The smell of soap mixed with steam created a dense atmosphere. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the outline of Josh's shoulders behind the translucent curtain. He seemed restless, moving quickly, a disconcerting anxiety. The incident hung there, between the fear of invading and the obligation to help. I pretended to be distracted, but stayed attentive, waiting for any sign that my presence was needed. When he finally came out of the bathroom, his face marked by drops and his eyes red, I realized something was different. Josh didn't try to hide his distress. He walked without looking at anyone, dropped his wet clothes, and went straight to his room. It was clear right then. Inside the house, something was breaking. Routine was no longer enough to contain the size of the silence he was carrying. I decided to break the ice with a simple action. I made a plate of fettuccine alfredo, an old fatty recipe, but one that usually pleased any tired stomach. I knocked on his bedroom door and invited Josh to eat with me. We sat at the table, each on one side, with the TV on low in the background, showing old movies. I steered the conversation toward neutral topics. I praised his dedication at work, asked about a band he'd been listening to, and talked about the engines that would soon need my attention. Little by little, he started to answer, loosening up. Between bites, he commented on the struggles at the market, the demanding boss, the lazy colleagues. He told quick stories without going into detail. I didn't insist. I preferred to let the silence speak for itself. At one point, I mentioned the school's Halloween party, joking about ridiculous costumes I wore in my early 20s. I saw a short, almost shy smile appear on his face. It was like watching a window open just a little bit into a dimly lit house. That dinner led to small exchanges that, far from curing the discomfort, built bridges. We talked about the horror movies we always watched in the fall, the fears and superstitions of the season. I noticed that Josh opened up more when the topic was a light memory, something without pressure. The mood became less heavy, our gestures more natural. The silence, once absolute, gave way to short sentences and discreet glances. After the meal, I suggested we go to the garage. I talked about fine-tuning an old carburetor, explained small parts, and let him observe closely. For me, working was a way to communicate without risk, to offer company, without asking too many questions. He got involved, helped me find tools, and pointed out details he hadn't noticed before. There, for a few minutes, I felt the distance between us shrinking, even if slowly. When we went to clean up, Josh stayed by my side longer than usual. There were no confessions, no moment of explicit intimacy, just the feeling that, between pasta, engines, and everyday conversations, we were learning to see each other beyond the traditional roles of stepfather and stepson. Despite the subtle progress, the atmosphere between us was still marked by delicate, almost invisible conflicts. Josh carried an insecurity that was hard to name. It was obvious in his distant way, a raw anxiety, a fear of showing his weaknesses. His movements were restrained, his answers always brief, his gaze darting to some fixed point on the floor. I sensed, more than I heard, the weight of someone fighting ghosts no one else could see. Maybe they were doubts about his health, about his appearance, or a fear of being different. I didn't know, but I had my suspicions. My own obstacle was no smaller. I was afraid of getting too close, of being invasive, of making a mistake in how I cared for him. I have a tendency to protect, but I've learned, from my past mistakes, that it's not always well received. I was living with the dilemma of whether to act or to wait. I was dealing with the fear of rejection, with the insecurity of how to show affection to the son of the woman I love. I didn't know if the silence was helping, or if, on the contrary, it was a wall between us. Domestic life during this period became an emotional minefield. Olivia called every night, asking for news about her son, sending loving messages from afar. I only reported the routine, omitting my worries. I knew Josh missed her, just as I did, but I didn't know if we should talk about it. Within each room, nuances of the internal conflict multiplied. The barrier of teenage pride, the fear of seeming weak, the weight of loneliness that sometimes is heavier when you're not alone. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night hearing footsteps in the hallway. I knew Josh also had insomnia. At those times, he was listening to music on his headphones, maybe trying to write something or draw. We had never talked about his dreams, about his fears, about growing up. I thought the best thing was to wait for him to open up, but I felt I might need to break that barrier. Not to impose advice, but to be a support. With this dilemma, each day became a painful exercise in how not to fail as a stepfather or as a man. Practical limitations also came into play. The market required Josh to work more hours, leaving him exhausted. I tried to relieve him of small responsibilities around the house, but he didn't always accept. Our conversations were frequent but superficial. There was a small but visible gap between what was said and what truly needed to be heard. Deep down, We knew. Something bigger was circling our relationship, waiting for an opening to emerge. The gloom took over the house that night, drawing strange outlines on the walls. The entire neighborhood seemed to be submerged in an even denser silence. I was sitting on the couch, distractedly flipping through the pages of an old motorcycle catalog, when I heard cautious footsteps in the hallway. It was Josh, wrapped in his gray blanket, with a closed-off expression. But there he was, approaching, almost like someone seeking refuge from an invisible storm. The smell of a newly lit candle mixed with sweetness and rust. The power had gone out that night, and even the hallway light was off. The atmosphere seemed to call for confessions, for the absence of judgment. Josh stopped in front of me, looking at the floor, the blanket wrapped around his shoulders like armor. I felt it was my job to break the heavy silence. I gestured for him to sit next to me on the rug. It was a simple gesture, but full of intention. If he wanted to talk, I was there, without pushing him away or pressuring him. After a few minutes, he started to speak. His voice was choked, almost raspy. He talked about his insecurity, that uncomfortable feeling when the world seems too big to fit inside your own skin. He confessed his doubts about himself, about his body, about the fear of not fitting into any standard that youth insisted on demanding. He said, in a nervous tone, about the moments when he would simply stare at the mirror and feel that everything was out of place. I was overcome with a serene impulse. I didn't interrupt. I listened to every word with attention, gathering the sorrow of each phrase as if they were loose pieces of a delicate mechanism. I talked about how internal ghosts never have a face, and that courage is in owning every fear, every shame, without having to hide. I said I've always had my own insecurities. Years ago, I didn't accept the way life pushed me into new arrangements, new families, new roles. The feeling of not belonging never completely left me. I just learned to deal with it. Josh listened, his eyes welling up in the unstable candlelight. The vulnerability was almost palpable. It was as if in that space, between blankets and shadows, he could just be himself, without fear of judgment. He hesitated, but told me about times he tried to talk to Olivia, but backed down. He thought she wouldn't understand. He revealed anxieties about his health, about intimate doubts, fears of growing up, of loving, of not knowing if he wanted to get into anything. I made it clear. There was no rush, no pressure. The world doesn't expect easy answers. In the middle of the conversation, there are moments where words no longer work, where only silence communicates. There, the closeness takes on a different texture. The warmth of hands nearby, suspended breathing, the simple smell of bath soap still clinging to his skin, mixed with the candle wax. I felt I should be a shelter, and not a judge. As if each sentence spoken were another step toward the rare and fragile trust that was earned at the cost of a lot of honesty. In that instant, I realized that a touch was possible, without hurry. A simple gesture, almost imperceptible. My hand touched Josh's forearm, not like someone taking, but like someone offering containment. I said softly, "Here, you can be any way you want. No one is going to judge you." He allowed himself to relax in that contact. His eyes closed for a few seconds, and his breathing slowed. I felt the tension give way, like ice slowly melting under the warmth of acceptance. It wasn't an explicit act, but a mutual invitation to surrender, to understanding, to the recognition of vulnerabilities. Small gestures multiplied. He rested his head lightly on my shoulder, taking advantage of the temporary and unique safety of that night. The connection was, above all, a celebration of emotional intimacy, of that safe space that rarely exists between men of different generations. We were flirting not just with desire, but most importantly, with the freedom to trust, to show ourselves completely, stripped of masks. The night went on with quiet words, subtle confessions, and senses sharpened by the silence that filled the room. Every minute, every approach, was a new discovery. This wasn't just a touch. It was a silent pact of care, of acceptance, and respect. I learned right then that sometimes what's missing isn't love, but the right to be accepted, even in unexpected moments. The gloom of the room, tempered by the flickering candlelight, seemed to create invisible borders that only existed to protect our moment. Josh remained by my side, the shy hug becoming an instinctive invitation to something more. His face, once veiled by the rigid expression of insecurity, now revealed a gentle softness. That instant transformed the environment. Each sound, each aroma, each movement added to the dense mood of surrender. The following minutes were filled with an eloquent silence, and an almost secret language between our gestures. The heat between us was like steam rising from boiling water, slow, persistent, enveloping every inch of skin. The touch of hands found a subtle rhythm, fingers interlaced in a casual way, but full of energy. There was no rush, only a desire for genuine communication, to abandon the shields built by fear and loneliness. Josh's gaze sought mine, sometimes flitting away in shyness, sometimes locking on with intensity. Emotions circulated like an invisible electric current, connecting not only our bodies, but everything that had been hidden for months. Insecurities, longings, the need to belong. Our bodies drew closer with respect, and between light hugs and touches, the outside world faded away. The blanket slipped slowly, as if removing the last defense. The physical act wasn't the center of the moment, but the ritual of welcoming, of allowing every insecurity to be accepted as part of the desire to open up. Time seemed to slow down. Slow touches explored the outline of arms, of shoulders. Our palms met in the trembling light, one of the candles sputtering, almost going out, leaving the room in soft orange tones. The scent of soap, mixed with the rustic essence of the room, created an atmosphere of rare closeness, where every breath was a silent exchange of secrets and promises. It was like discovering a new language where words didn't fit. Josh nestled closer, the heat between us overflowing with a contained and deep desire. My hands slid along his back, guiding the way over tense nerves, dissolving the stiffness, offering comfort. He no longer shrank away. He allowed himself to surrender, with full trust, his eyes moist with the feeling of finally finding some meaning in the touch. Everything was done with delicacy. Hugs turning into caresses, faces close, legs intertwined, lips brushing discreetly. The desire was never vulgar. It was genuine, the result of months of silence, of held-back desires, of the hope of being noticed, of being cared for. The follies of youth dissolved between deep breaths. And, for a few minutes, fear no longer existed, only the most delicate and intense pleasure of seeing yourself whole in the eyes of the other. Josh's body reacted in silent waves of comfort. The meeting was a work of art. Slow discoveries, fingers tracing paths, each touch a new revelation. By nurturing this communion, we brought to the surface everything that everyday life had hidden. A subtle sweat increased the shine on his skin. The scent was a promise of belonging. It wasn't the rush of movies. It was the delicacy of affection discovered at the right time, as if each gesture asked to be stored in memory. In the end, no words could translate what was happening inside. Just synchronized breaths, tight hugs, understanding looks. It was full acceptance, not just of the body, but of all insecurities. In that moment, I knew I would never forget the intensity with which we allowed ourselves to be vulnerable, human, and whole. We slowly returned to the reality of the living room, still wrapped in the gloom. Our bodies moved apart just enough for our eyes to maintain the connection of what had just happened. The night was calm. The cold wind outside no longer had the strength to get into the house, which was so filled with new meanings. After that peak, we lay side by side on the rug, sharing the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed to run from themselves. The first consequence was the change in the internal atmosphere. Neither of us was in a hurry to get up. We lay there watching the shadows on the ceiling, each lost in our own thoughts. I felt my chest was lighter, an unfamiliar feeling of a mission accomplished, but also a sense of unease about the future. Josh was, clearly, more at ease, with the expression of someone who had cried and was smiling at the same time. The relief was physical, emotional, almost spiritual. We talked little about what had happened at that moment. There was no room for regrets or demands. I reaffirmed that he could trust me, not just with his anxieties, but with his deepest desires, dreams, and doubts. Josh thanked me with a shy smile, a gesture that needed no explanation. The physical contact was replaced by gestures of tenderness, a stroke of his hair, a comforting touch on his hand. That night created a point of reference, a support that we would learn to use from then on. In the days that followed, the routine returned to its rhythm, but it was irreversibly transformed. Josh no longer avoided eye contact. On the contrary, he sought to talk, to ask questions, to share secrets about delicate topics, feelings, health, fears about the future, and family relationships. His emotional distance was replaced by sincere attempts at closeness, sometimes shy, sometimes brave. The pattern of our interactions changed, gifted by the memory of that intimate and sensitive encounter. I changed too. I discovered that my job was less about correcting mistakes and more about being a harbor, about accepting weaknesses without looking for definitive answers. I started to think more carefully about my words and my gestures. I had more patience in conversations, and made it my mission to create a safe environment for Josh to grow, learn, and find himself. The emotional impact was significant. We both found a more comfortable place to exist within that home. The episode didn't eliminate doubts or problems, but it created a strong enough bond to face the days ahead. Trust, once only assumed, was now shared. We were no longer just an obligatory part of a family, but partners in a daily search for meaning, relief, and truth. Standing in the garage, looking at my tools, I think the biggest change was invisible. The living room rug, the now extinguished candles, the smell on the blanket. Everything became a symbol of a silent, personal turning point. A pact made without written promises. Everyday life became lighter, and from then on, every conversation between us gained more weight, color, and depth. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was space for confessions, dreams, and discoveries. Soon, Olivia would be back. The routine would continue with old and new problems. But now, inside the house, there was space to be more honest, less alone, and definitely less lost. A gesture, a night, an encounter. That was enough for the tide of insecurity to finally begin to recede. When the sunlight broke through the curtains the next day, it was possible to notice small changes in the house's atmosphere. The smell of fresh coffee marked the morning, as always, but there was something new there, still undefined. Olivia texted to say she would be home in 2 days, full of longing and questions. The contact with Josh, previously limited to quick and minimal dialogues, gained a new frequency, as if the world had reorganized around new possibilities. At first, I confess I felt strange. It wasn't easy to name what had happened. The encounter the night before left subtle marks, a less tense closeness, looks that sought confirmation and understanding, gestures of affection without masks. Josh didn't avoid my presence or return to his usual silence. On the contrary, he seemed to look for reasons to stay close, even in the smaller daily tasks. We cooked together, laughed at everyday silly things, and talked about small details of the world that had previously been forgotten in the silence. I was afraid of making hasty decisions. What we experienced could be a turning point, or just a pause in the cycle of loneliness that surrounded us. I wasn't sure if Olivia would notice any new signs between us, but it wasn't my intention to hide anything either. It was more important to protect the space of trust that we had finally built. On Friday morning, with Olivia's return approaching, I noticed that Josh was more thoughtful, as if he was organizing his words before deciding how he would act. I felt a mix of pride and anxiety when I realized he was finally allowing the world to see weakness, doubt, and hope. Our dialogues, now free from the oppressive tension of before, addressed issues that had previously been swept under the rug: sexuality, health, fears about the future, and family relationships. I tried to answer honestly, without imposing my values, just listening and giving him space. Deep down, I knew our relationship was different, but that everything depended on how we would handle that change. Saturday came, and with it, the promise of a return to routine. Olivia would arrive in the afternoon, with bags full of gifts and questions. Josh made coffee with more care than usual, set the table, and took care of details he had previously ignored. I noticed a sparkle in his eyes, not of common excitement but of expectation. Instead of retreating to his room, he moved around the house, talked without fear, asked about motorcycles, about small facts from my childhood, laughed at stories from the repair shop, and wanted to learn. The atmosphere was full of both goodbye and a new beginning. I knew that this transitional moment was delicate. The bond we had created had withstood the time of Olivia's absence, but how would it hold up in the face of her return? There was a truth between us now that couldn't be ignored. We were no longer just stepfather and stepson, but partners in confession, accomplices in secrets and insecurities. The distance from before no longer made sense, at least for me. Olivia arrived and upon entering the house, noticed the difference in the air. She hugged Josh with an almost urgent tenderness. She talked to me, asked about everything she had missed. She smiled, but she watched out of the corner of her eye, as if absorbing changes in behavior, the signs of something new. Josh reacted to his mother's affection without flinching, still shy, but available. When we sat down for dinner, the conversations flowed, and I could notice Josh's transformation. He participated, made eye contact, asked questions, and made us laugh. That night, after our chores were done, Josh hesitated in the hallway before going to bed. He stopped in front of me, lightly held my arm, and said in a low voice, "Thank you for everything, for letting me be myself." I just replied with a smile and a handshake. Nothing more was needed there. Time would continue, charting unknown paths, but the space for vulnerability was guaranteed. There was no traditional goodbye, no formal break or new start. Just the silent decision to stay, to continue building, together, an environment of acceptance and friendship, even in the face of the challenges that family brings. I started to see Josh as more than a stepson, as someone who needed me, a refuge for his anxieties, and who could also be my support, my mirror of vulnerabilities. I learned not to demand immediate answers for anything. I just created space so that, in his own time, he could come back whenever he needed consistency, security, someone to talk to. The weeks that followed further cemented this relationship. Josh sought out my company even for trivial tasks, watering plants, watching movies, cooking pasta. Trust was established with the naturalness of a well-adjusted routine. And even when the inevitable hesitation returned, it was quickly replaced by sincere exchanges, knowing looks, and gentle gestures. We discovered, together, that staying can also be a silent and brave option, capable of healing wounds that once seemed impossible. Today, writing this story at the garage table, I feel that everything has changed. Not just because we managed to get past our barriers, but because we allowed vulnerability to become a strength. I learned that creating a space of trust doesn't require big speeches. It just takes patience, careful listening, and respect for each person's timing and silence. Over the years, I've been shaping my role in the family, thinking I needed to control everything. Now I understand that the best thing you can do for the people you love is to offer a firm ground for every insecurity. Josh, in this new scenario, is no longer just a lost teenager. He's slowly becoming an adult, taking ownership of his own doubts and facing fears with more clarity. Life doesn't offer easy answers or eliminate tensions, but now we share the certainty that, even on the toughest nights, no one needs to hide. No one needs to walk through the dark corridors of the house alone. Olivia noticed the change. She brought a new lightness, an intense joy into the house, praising every small accomplishment, every recovered smile of Josh's. She asked in a playful tone if I had found it fun to take care of two young people in crisis. I just replied that we all need a house full of space for confessions and forgiveness. And she smiled, happy to see Josh more free, less withdrawn. In the end, the most important thing wasn't the episode itself, but what came after. Daily life gained color, every conversation deepened, every hug became more sincere. I started to observe more, to judge less, to intervene only when I believed I could be useful. Josh opened up, asked for advice, and shared his dreams. Our relationship, imperfect but real, became a network of support and strength. My biggest lesson? Transformation is in the details. A plate of pasta, a conversation lit by candles, an unexpected gesture of affection. You don't have to turn life into a series of big events. Sometimes, the simple act of not running from your own feelings is enough to change everything. If you followed this story this far, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Every life has its episodes of pain, its sighs of joy, and its secrets kept in the dim light. And above all, every family carries its choices. To leave, to stay, to fight, to give up, to start over. So, if you also believe that building bridges is better than building walls, give this a like now. Subscribe to the channel to follow new stories, and share your own experiences of overcoming and affection in the comments. Who knows? In the next episodes, the courage to open up might be what someone on the other side of the screen needs to discover they were never alone. What you're hearing here is just the beginning. The full, unfiltered stories, with all the details you can imagine, are available now. Check the link in the description right now. Here, between tools and memories, I learned that sometimes it's enough to just listen, to welcome, and to allow. That's enough to transform not just an ordinary night, but an entire existence. See you soon.